For as long as humanity has been, we have looked to the past to divine the future. We are cognizant dominoes, and those that topple before us take on the role of de facto educators, mediums through which we can measure our own trajectories. For better or worse, it is the actions and inactions of our antecedents to which we owe modernity, and thus it is only through reaching an understanding of them and then may we begin to grasp us and now. The effect of the predecessor, their beliefs and ideologies, not only form a cultural reality, but pave a way for those able to identify with that reality to understand themselves in the present. There is no greater instructor than the experience of one who has walked the same or a similar path. So what if that historical through line was severed, forgotten, or was never allowed to exist in the first place? How could one begin to manifest the future without first identifying the history that informs it? The death of a history is not often one of natural cause. Very few aspire to be forgotten, and the desire to remember and honor who and what came before is a behavior extant in virtually every human culture. The structures counted amongst the oldest surviving in the world are tombs, memorials, and burial sites. Prior to written language, oral tradition carried information and culture across generational lines for thousands of years. And inversely, the fear of being forgotten, the inevitable day that will pass in which someone speaks your name for the very last time, has haunted many to tyranny. Desperate to conquer the total arbitrative power beheld only to the sands of time, humanity combines to form a collective Ozymandias, defined by its desperate need to write a signature upon the face of eternity. To put things simply, people want to remember, and people really want to be remembered. Thus, it is true that the wild flames of history, kindled by dynasties of tired torchbearers, are rarely extinguished willfully. The flame that burns so long does not just idly peter out, it is smothered, and the hands that smother the flame belong to the invader, the Puritan, and the bigot. Those that subjugate any minority group have identified a surefire way to obstruct the future and prosperity of any people, the destruction of their connection to history, as when you sever someone from the past, you isolate them in the present. The suppression of queer history has proven to be an unfortunately easy bigotry to exercise. There exists no way to truly determine gender or sexual identity other than self-determination and expression. Therefore, all that is necessary to effectively eliminate queerness from history is to make it socially or legally impossible to make that identification public. If someone is unable to freely express how they feel and who they love during their life, upon their death they will leave a plausible deniability from which any and all queerness will be denied. Lovers will become friends and roommates, those at odds with their birth gender or the binary at large, or eccentrics or cross-dressers, because while cisgender and heterosexual identity is an assumed baseline, queer identity demands proof, a proof it could never possibly provide from within the confines of the closet in which it had been forced. And this denial persists in death, because if you die in that closet, they will bury you in it. For much of history, as recent as the last few decades and ongoing in much of the world, to be openly queer was martyrdom, a crime punishable by lashings, imprisonment, or death, sometimes a mental disorder befitting electroshock, castration, and lobotomy. Through a modern lens, to understand the trials and tribulations of queer history, we, at best, in the names of heroes, iconoclasts, and victims, often only post-mortem. Entirely vacant in a pre-queer liberated society is a status quo, a queer ordinary of extraordinary importance. Because although there will always be some who will love who they love and live as they are, even if it may lose them their lives, many more have and will spend every waking moment, from birth unto death, never given the safety or support to live comfortably within their own bodies. Denied a role in history, when queer people were finally granted any semblance of liberation, many faced an ultimatum: accept a painful, shameful privacy, or take the unenviable role of pioneer. As when all you have are heroes, there is no blueprint for normalcy. It is one thing to be openly queer. It's another to be the first queer football player, politician, or prime minister. So how did we get here? And to what forces do we owe this missing queer status quo? There is no single answer, as any system of oppression requires, at the very least, compliance from most, if not all, arms of its societal machine. The most destructive, potentially, is the compliance of the scholar and the academic. In my hand, I hold the tome, Stanford University's current medical diagnoses and treatments, current as of 1976. It is 1,023 pages long, but my favorite is page 613, titled Psychological Disorders, subsection Sexual Dysfunction, of which I will share with you. Atop the first page of Sexual Dysfunction, the authors write of homosexuality. Then it includes savagery, such as transsexualism and bisexuality, followed with brief discussions of treatments, most notably conversion therapy, writing The writer admits the repeated frustrations and low success rate of such conversions, and then goes on the same page to describe the further dysfunctions of bestiality, incest, pedophilia, and necrophilia. Less than 50 years ago, one of the most prestigious and respected academic medical institutions in the world gathered a team comprised of the most accomplished academic medical minds they could access, and they published a book. They published a book that placed equal weight on the acts of a gay or a trans person with those having sex with animals, corpses, and children. These are the stories we have been afforded. We're in just the last few decades the most educated people in the world intellectualize hate and ignorance as medicine and science. The queer status quo as it has been recorded is disappointing but unsurprising, and functions as just a fragment of the bigoted legacy queer people have been given. Some may claim these to be merely the biases and bigotries representative of the time in which they were written, a time that we have left behind, but history begets modernity, and such a claim is a pathetic excuse. Contrary ideas had been expressed and developed more than a century earlier. To find these writings, look no further than the aforementioned queer martyrs, like the artist Claude Gautin, who would not only function as a key inspiration for my work, but would shadow my understandings of history. In their work, Disavowals, from the original French, Gautin writes, masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillations. I'd be a worker bee for good. That was written in 1930. As I consumed the work of Gautin, a complete bewilderment took me, for what I was seeing and reading seemed impossible and totally anachronistic. It was like a stone was thrown nearly a century earlier, had landed and shattered my understandings. I felt like I was seeing roses bloom between cracked seams of city pavement. How could this emerge from such a time and place? How could soil so polluted, so toxic and trodden upon, still manage to yield something, someone like this? And I came to understand it was my own misgivings of history that had led me to such confusion. I had understood my own gender queerness to be something new, something you could only possibly feel given a modern understanding of gender and sexuality. Gender fluidity was only officially coined in the 1990s. I had believed that being given the respect and space required to understand myself was somehow the precursor to my identity's existence, and that I had lived in any other time, I would have by necessity lived a life of shame and confusion. My whole life I had been equating the suppression of this identity prior to liberation to its not functionally existing, but finally it was through words scribed nearly a century prior that the seventh through line to history was restored, and for the first time in my life I did not feel isolated from the world that had preceded me. And these revelations reveal the sadness that were present in Gautin's work, only visible when viewed inversely, but as remarkable as they were, the brilliance of their work is owed in no small part to the inherent triumph through adversity it displays simply by existing, an adversity that very few could overcome. And to borrow from my previous metaphor, when a rose blossoms through a cement ceiling despite the impossible hostility of its environment, a miracle occurs. Something rebukes the reality that spawned it, but for every petal that manages to bloom in such a state, 1,000 buds will remain trapped below, rotting and decaying in darkness, in a closet beneath the concrete, because miracles may be beautiful, and they may inspire through their representation of something seemingly impossible deviating from reality, but it must be acknowledged that we cannot all be miracles. And even now, there are those confined to closets, in footholds in which bigotry still holds the gavel. Cultural institutions like the AFL to this day have still not had a single active player walk onto the field as anything other than a straight cisgender man. It may just be a matter of time until a queer player dons an AFL jersey, but progress does not count backwards. Of the some 13,000 players in the professional history of the sport, consider how many played every game, every match, haunted by the prospect of being outed. Heroes to children that were rewarded for their heroism by being buried in a disguise that was forced upon them. For to be anything other than what they were demanded to be would both define and destroy them. Just how many histories were stamped out before they had a chance to blossom. These were the ideas that formed the bedrock of my work. I wanted to represent these suppressed and obscured realities, and I would use my body, of which I've struggled for a long time. And I hoped that by inserting my own genderqueer self into history, I'd find a way to quantify it, to live in that absent queer ordinary, roles that were largely devoid of or abhorred queerness. I would make my body a canvas, a slow initial process. I'd develop my film and then look at my negatives in disgust. Even in makeup, in character, I hated looking at myself. A doppelganger I despised. I would turn my prints over as to not feel watched by my own eyes, but I pushed forward, and as I did, I noticed something changing. Not with the project, not with the prints, but with myself. As I'd altered the makeup, how I looked and how I presented, I'd shoot, same film, same location, same camera, yet each time there was a different person in the frame. I was an archaeologist dusting a millennia of debris and earth from atop a long since buried, mummified body, and with each pass of my brush, more dry, decrepit skin came away, like I was tearing mildewed pages from a weathered old book. And as the skin peeled, so did the years of neglect. When I finally stopped, the skin was no longer withered but soft, indistinguishable from the earth and clay that had encased it. And I grabbed it. I took handfuls of my own skin and I began to paint. I painted these portraits, these mirrors, mirror after mirror, and with each rendition my visage would change alongside its reflection. I painted atop a canvas of my own bone. The stiff skeleton felt foreign to my fingers, and I paused. I felt notches, riddles carved into my ribcage, directions, a list of landmarks I had written in case I ever lost my way, but they were written in a language I no longer spoke. And frustrated, I took the clay and I filled the notches like wine fills cracked lips. I pushed down atop the quarries that a younger self had bored, and I realized something was emerging. Text, words all over my hand that had transferred as I patted down atop those values of self. This time legible to my eyes, it read, "Please, please do not forget." And I wept, for I could not recall what I had once begged myself to remember. As I cried, tears rolled down my face like beads of mercury. The liquid metal pooled in my lap, and it formed that final mirror. The last portrait was finally staring back at me. It was only then that I understood that creating this facsimile of history, I was uncovering a framework through which I could understand myself as I was now. Through the shoots, I'd donned so many costumes, but in those disguises, I realized how long I'd felt like a stranger was beneath my skin. When I grabbed that leather football and I ran my fingers over its surface, I was touching cracked, dry earth. The half-time orange beneath my teeth leaked juice that poured down my chin, and as I bit into the rind, I screamed. How stupid had I been not to have looked before my own nose, to have allowed myself to be buried alive, decaying beneath my own cowardice. I let the pressure, the unrelenting, suffocating atmosphere crush me into a crude shape, an amalgam of insecurity and doubt. And it would be funny if it weren't so sad that I had to forge an identity in the past and discover one in the present. And at last I stood up. But not like I'd stood up 1,000 times before, because this time there was no crude marionette tugging on strings bound to my lethargic, leprous limbs. I was again myself, and by tapping on that shattered mirror to history, I'd begun to repair it. I'd understood at last that in the present, the privilege afforded to me to live as I preferred and carve out a future in which I and people like me may be safe, happy and comfortable, had in turn allowed me to build a history, to create a reminder that we are not new, that we were there, that we have always been there. Thank you.